Thank you so much to Paul and Rebecca for the offertory. That was beautiful. Good morning. I'm Reverend Michelle Scott-Huffman. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm the minister here at First Unitarian Universalist Church. A reading from On Joy and Sorrow from The Prophet by Khalil Gibran. Then a woman said, "Speak to us of joy and sorrow." And he answered, "Your joy is your sorrow unmasked, and the selfsame well from which your laughter rises was oftentimes filled with your tears. And how else can it be? The deeper that sorrow carves into your being, the more joy you can contain. It's not the cup that holds your wine, the very cup that was burned in the potter's oven. And is not the lute that soothes your spirit the very wood that was hollowed with knives? When you are joyous, look deep into your heart, and you shall find it is only that which has given you sorrow that is giving you joy. When you are sorrowful, look again in your heart, and you shall see that in truth you are weeping for that which has been your delight. Some of you say joy is greater than sorrow, and others say, nay, sorrow is greater. But I say unto you, they are inseparable. Together they come, and when one sits alone with you at your board, remember that the other is asleep on your bed. Verily, you are suspended like scales between your sorrow and your joy. Only when you are empty are you at a standstill and balanced. When the treasure keeper lifts you to weigh gold and silver, needs must your joy or your sorrow rise or fall. As I was preparing for this message today, I stumbled across a blog post by a minister that had been written for All Souls Day. The title of the post was, "When Heaven Tastes Like a Jello Salad." Almost immediately, I felt a kinship with this writer. Now, I would invite you to do whatever translation it is that you need to do for the word heaven, so that you might appreciate her story too. As a person who has long identified as a universalist, it's become fairly easy for me to translate someone else's concept of heaven as simply whatever it is that comes next. It makes space mostly for the fact that I don't think we can know what's next, but also an openness for others to believe what they need or want to. None of that matters too much, though, because it wasn't the talk of heaven that interested me. Rather, it was the mention of Jello salad. Everett writes about the experience of being a young girl at the funeral of her aunt who had died far too early after battling a debilitating illness that eventually won, and counted among its casualties the departed family member and many among the living who had been caring for her for years. She remembers attending the funeral at a Methodist church somewhere in the Midwest, and she writes, "After the unremarkable service, we dutifully filed into the fellowship hall, dazed. Before us on thin, worn tablecloths were small ham sandwiches on squishy white rolls dressed with iceberg lettuce and mayonnaise, green bean casserole made with cream of mushroom soup and neatly cut lemon squares. And then a sight that my East Coast family and I had never seen before, an entire table filled with Jello salads, as in the Technicolor rainbow after the flood. Cherry Jello with sliced bananas suspended in the ruby glow, orange Jello with mandarin oranges sliced into squares so you could pick them up with your fingers, lemon Jello with crushed pineapple, artfully shaped in a bundt pan mold, green Jello with shredded carrots threatening to escape, and finally, raspberry blue Jello with swirls of white Cool Whip, making the whole thing look like the froth of the ocean as imagined by a 4-year-old. As I read her words, I remembered my own young experience of the funerals of my 4th grade best friend and my older brother within the span of about 9 months. As I navigated those strange, sad spaces for the first time as a 10 and 11-year-old, I too must have walked around in a daze. I don't remember anything that was said during those services, but forever stamped in my memory are sounds and smells and tastes. The sound of our friend Chad fainting during Kendra's funeral with a thud as his head hit the pew in front of him, followed by a collective gasp. The smell of devastated mothers and grandmothers wearing too much Mary Kay perfume and sitting too close together for anyone's comfort in the packed sanctuary, which might have had something to do with Chad fainting. The tastes of bland, mushy, well-intentioned funeral food, followed by the sweetness of cookies or brownies baked lovingly by church ladies who were simultaneously thankful it wasn't their family member and painfully aware that it had been and would be again someday. From my brother's funeral, I remember the discomfort of the dress I was wearing. If you know me, you can probably imagine why that might have been uncomfortable for me. And its short sleeves that were surely not enough for a Christmas Eve funeral. Even more than that, I remember the itch and the attempt to not scratch all of my skin off while sitting in the front row of a crowded funeral home because I had chickenpox, which I graciously shared with a few folks who came to the funeral, most impressively my friend Aaron, who took them back to Connecticut to start an outbreak of his own among his East Coast friends and family. Over the years, I would add many memories of both attending and leading funerals and memorial services, and even once leading when I showed up thinking I was attending. Among my grown-up memories are the bizarre experience of leading my first funeral as an ordained clergy person in a funeral home decked out with horse decor, and the funeral director whose phone began to ring right at the end of the service when all was quiet and he was directing the pallbearers to their places around the casket. Not only did he not quickly silence the phone, he answered it right there in the front of the room. But not until after we'd heard enough of his ringtone to make out the Johnny Cash tune, Ring of Fire. And then there's the sweet memory of Tom Kinsey's memorial service earlier this year in the sanctuary at First UU, where we looked out the back windows as the service was beginning to see the biggest, most beautiful snowflakes I've ever seen, gently falling around us as we remembered Tom and his impact on so many people. I think that was the last memorial service I attended. Maybe it was for some of you as well. 9 weeks later, the world would shut down as the novel coronavirus made its presence known here in Springfield and pretty much everywhere else. It's not that we haven't lost other beloved members, friends, and family members since then. Many of you know all too well that we have, but that so many of the usual rituals that help us process and move through our grief have been unavailable to us in the time of social distancing. And it's been so hard. We've had to find new ways of saying goodbye, of sharing memories and stories, and of letting go, even as we hold on to hopes and plans for the gatherings and remembrances that will happen someday when we can all be together again. And that day will come. On a Colorado public radio podcast started during the pandemic called At a Distance, a woman named Tracy shares the story of losing her father to cancer during the pandemic and how this strange time that we're in felt both helpful and difficult. She spoke of feeling community in her initial grief because it seemed like the world was grieving with her. Some were grieving the loss of a loved one. Others were grieving the loss of work, loss of income, loss of celebrations for major life events like weddings and graduations, and even just a loss of normalcy. The difficulty for her came at the point where we would normally find ourselves leaning on and lifted up by those around us whose worlds hadn't come crashing down. She spoke of the beauty in the fact that when we ourselves are suffering a loss, we can typically count on the fact that there are folks around us who are okay, well, even thriving, because sometimes we need those folks to keep the world spinning for us while all we can do is sit still. So what she found difficult is that it seemed that everyone's world had stopped spinning, and there was nobody around her well enough to be able to tend to her emotional needs. As I heard Tracy tell her story, I was reminded once again of the beauty and depth of the relationships in this first UU community, where people have been there to tend to one another's needs, even in the midst of social distancing. Even in the midst of personal struggle, the community comes together to care for one another, to check in on each other, to hold compassionate space for one another as we grieve and adapt to new realities in our lives. As your minister, I'm challenged to envision the ways that those circles of care and concern can continue to grow, to include those newer to this community and even those outside the community. And I'm inspired by the ways that I see you working to expand those circles in so many ways. In the last 3 weeks, 3 men living unsheltered on the streets of Springfield have died. We don't know their stories or their struggles, but we do know that they had stories, that they had friends and maybe families that have been looking for them or worrying about them, or maybe no family at all. I'm so proud of the work that we are doing to provide warm clothing, blankets, and more to help our unsheltered neighbors try and make it through the winter, and to work for systemic change, to help prevent more homelessness, and to advocate for safe and affordable housing for all people. I hope that as we do that work, we do it holding the weight of each life lost, knowing the inherent worth and dignity of every human being, even and especially those whose worth has been called into question, who, after all, is not worthy of a meal, a bed, a roof, a memorial. These are hard times, friends, in so many ways. The grief and loss is real and is difficult to wade through some days. The fear and anxiety around all of the unknowns is thick. The sorrow is plentiful. And also, as Khalil Gibran reminds us, the deeper that sorrow carves into your being, the more joy you can contain. Our joy will return. It will be a mixture of relief that this thing has ended someday and pride in the fact that we figured out new ways of being, because there will surely be new normals. Our joy will be a result of having put one foot in front of the other day after day, not knowing quite where we were going, but knowing that we weren't going alone. It will be found in the seemingly eternal reshaping of the lump of clay that is our grief, after we've taken it out and squished it between our fingers over and over again, creating something new and then smashing it back down in despair into an indistinguishable lump and hiding it away again, only to feel inspired on another day to take it out and create more beauty from the mess. For years, counselors, therapists, and clergy have been helped in providing care for those who are grieving for a host of reasons by an understanding of the 5 stages of grief as laid out by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross in her 1969 book. Those stages are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And any of us who have grieved anything know that they don't happen in linear form, but sometimes they're more like a revolving elevator that spins you around and lets you out on a different floor each time, failing to announce in advance which floor you'll be let out on. Decades after Stages of Grief, Kubler-Ross and David Kessler teamed up to write the classic book On Grief and Grieving. And just last year, David Kessler released his newest book, suggesting that there is a 6th incredibly important stage in the grieving process, which is finding meaning. There is meaning to be made in this time. And there is meaning being made even now while we are in the midst of the difficulty. I see it in individual conversations with you, in our UU Connections conversations on Tuesday, and casual conversation about spiritual practices on Wednesdays, and our monthly Soul Matters small group conversations. I see it being made by our membership committee, who is working to make sure that folks who come along while we are not physically together have a meaningful path to becoming a part of the community. I see it in the activity of So-So making masks and warming sacks to keep people safe and warm, and in the gathering of the humanist group and the book group and families engaging together in soulful home activities. There is so much beautiful meaning being found in our struggles, big and small. And even now, we are being transformed in ways we can't even imagine. Dr. Rohini Kanaganti, who specializes in the end of life care and grief, says that as people move through grief and struggle, they start to become something that they never expected. She says that sometimes our suffering, pain, and grief are the opening to the door we've been waiting for. Whatever it is that we're struggling with right now, even when so many of our markers and rituals are missing, we can know that we are held by something larger than our individual selves. We are held by hope and human resilience. We are held by divine love, community care, and by the memories, stories, and strength of our ancestors and those who have touched our lives and departed from us. On this All Souls Day, may we remember and give thanks. May we forgive and know our own forgiveness. May we find rest, relief, reconciliation, and renewal. And may we be inspired to live into the legacy that we hope to leave in the hands and hearts of those we love and care for. Blessed be, and amen.